Welcome to the Pennsylvania Historical Markers series. Thanks, everyone. We're here in Pennsylvania, Hershey, Pennsylvania, at the Chocolate Workers Sit-Down Strike Historical Marker. Hershey Chocolate Workers Local Number 1 CIO responded to a labor management impasse on April 2nd, 1937 by initiating the first sit-down strike in Pennsylvania and in the confectionery industry. The strike was ended by strike-breaking violence and government mediation. The union lost 2 subsequent representative elections in 1939 to workers affiliated with the bakery and confectionery workers local 464, the AFL, which that is that right there. This is a pretty notable strike. We'll talk more about that, what the consequences of it were, and what sort of caused some of the different issues. It's the one, I would say, if you had a blight on Hershey's record, this was it. You know, part of him, he sort of thought that he really did take care of his workers, but they felt like they wanted to unionize, they wanted slightly better conditions. And with everything he had done, especially after the Great Depression when he did all this, you know, everybody kept their jobs, and in a lot of cases people didn't. He sort of felt like he shouldn't have to do that. And there were, I think, some of the people that were brought in to break up the strike, there was some violence there, but I think a lot of the violence that actually happened was local farmers who got really, really mad because their milk wasn't being bought then, and they got really ticked and they came after the workers. So that was just one of those things that sort of happened. You can see that in different eras of history. When something came in that sort of took away from people's work, they got upset. I was just watching a documentary series on Victorian farms, and they had, I guess, a threshing machine, which, you know, at the time with wheat, to separate the chaff, I guess, from the actual seeds, it was a very labor-intensive job. And when the threshing machine came along, that replaced all that labor, and these were unskilled laborers, so they got quite upset when their jobs were no longer there. So there was a lot of violence broke out, and they'd come in and bust up the machines and that type of stuff. And that's just sort of throughout history, that's sort of what has happened in these types of instances. So but I'm going to do a little bit more on this and talk about this a little more, but this is the one blight. I'll also talk about this in the Milton Hershey series that we're doing, the 3-parter. This is the one thing he always regretted. He never intended it to go that way, but there were reasons behind both sides. You know, neither side was necessarily in the wrong until the violence started. That was obviously an issue, but with that, we will move on. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you all about town. So Hershey, Pennsylvania witnessed a 6-day sit-down strike at the corporation. The strike unfortunately ended in violence as dairy workers and loyal Hershey employees stormed the factory to force out strikers. Eventually, these workers signed an agreement with the American Federation of Labor through the Bakery and Confectionery International Union, and they became one of the earliest American candy companies to unionize. So the background of this, just to give a little more information, they did have some grievances. This company was founded in 1894 by Milton Hershey and became one of the richest candy companies in existence. In its first 3 decades, Hershey, Pennsylvania was an idyllic company town that thrived no matter what was going on in the rest of the country. Hershey was generally seen as a benevolent employer, providing benefits, retirement plans, and amenities to workers before they were commonplace. All of that changed, though, with the Great Depression and the explosion of the labor movement. Before the Depression, Hershey employees were accustomed to a 60-hour work week, so when they were restricted to 40-hour weeks, many had difficulty getting by on their post-Depression paychecks. Initially, Milton Hershey could legitimately keep tight controls on hours and wages because it was required under the NRA, or the National Recovery Administration. But when the NRA was found later to be unconstitutional, and then it could no longer be enforced. From 1930 to 1936, Milton Hershey had spent more than $10 million on building up Hershey, and that was something we had talked about in the Hershey video. He did quite a few, like the Hershey Community Building, Hotel Hershey, that Posers Building most likely, also the transportation, a lot of different things that he added on to improve people's lives. But in doing so, he reduced the hours of his employees and stopped paying annual bonuses. In those 6 years, the Hershey Chocolate Corporation, blah, 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 they had made more than $37 million in after-tax profits. Another one of the things that the Hershey employees resented was the paternalistic attitude of the company. Milton Hershey built a town for his workers, attempting to cater to their material and spiritual needs, including entertainment and education. But not everyone was comfortable with living in a place where everything was controlled by one man and his executives. They felt that the degree of the control and the entanglement with their personal lives meant that many hiring and firing decisions were made based on individual relationships and favoritism, and this disturbed some employees and made them receptive to the CIO organizers in 1937. In the last weeks of 1936, a newsletter called the Chocolate Bar Bee began to circulate around the chocolate factory. This leaflet aired grievances over low wages, erratic work schedules, and the recent orders to speed up production. This pamphlet insisted that chocolate workers did perform physically demanding labor with deafening levels of noise and temperatures over 100 degrees. It also scolded the big bosses, Murray, as William Murray, who was the CEO at the time, and Milton Hershey for their high salaries and slave-driving methods. This newsletter was signed by the Communist Party of Hershey, Pennsylvania, and strongly advised the workers to unionize. In January 1937, members of the CIO held a secret meeting at a firehouse in Palmyra, Pennsylvania. After the meeting, several hundred Hershey employees formed a local of the United Chocolate Workers Union, and within weeks, several hundred factory workers had joined. When the union first approached Hershey to negotiate, they were met with very little resistance. The corporation reported it would raise wages to 60 cents an hour for men and 45 cents an hour for women. After the initial agreement, Hershey laid off some union organizers as part of what the company president, William Murray, said to be part of seasonal cutbacks. The CIO argued that Hershey violated the promises of job security for union organizers in their March agreement. Union members met back at the firehouse on April 1st, 1937, and decided the fishy layoffs were the final straw. On April 2nd, 1937, at 11 in the morning, Union President Russell Bull Bayman waved a red checkered handkerchief outside the Hershey Chocolate Factory and signaled the strike was on. In a matter of minutes, the machines were switched off and the whole building went silent. Some sat down at their posts, others went outside to picket, and hundreds took to the roofs of the factory buildings along Chocolate Avenue. During lunchtime, the workers, still loyal to Hershey, went home. It's really unclear of how many actually took part in the strike. The organizers claimed 1,200, while Hershey executives said 400. Strikers decided they would sit down in shifts. Food would be supplied by the union kitchen. Surveillance cameras would make sure Hershey's property was not damaged, and smoking was banned in the sanitary areas of the factory. A few days of the strike seemed peaceful as strikers smiled for cameras and were optimistic about negotiations. They described it more as like a family squabble than an angry revolution. But workers were no longer dealing with Milton Hershey, who may have actually been willing to work with them. Instead, they faced new executive William Murray, who was strongly anti-union, and Murray announced the company would not bargain until the strikers left the factory. Hershey's reputation as mostly a kind corporation meant that the strikers faced resistance from many fronts. The chocolate factory had 3,000 workers, and the larger corporation employed nearly 2,000 people in other areas of the company that wanted nothing to do with the strike. The most resistance came from the thousands of dairy farmers from surrounding areas who relied on selling their milk to the Hershey factory. They were losing about 800,000 pounds of milk per day, and that was enough to supply a city of 1 million people. So naturally, these guys were allies of the anti-union groups. On the 5th of April, the fourth day of the strike, the dairy farmers met with strikers to discuss lost milk sales. The strikers decided to help the farmers by agreeing to operate the factory's creamery so the milk could be processed. Unfortunately, the next day, the Hershey milkmen failed to pick up the milk. On the evening of the 6th, several thousand loyal workers and farmers marched through Palmyra, Pennsylvania, in support of the Hershey Chocolate Corporation. At 11 o'clock the next morning, April 7th, more than 3,000 Hershey supporters rallied to remove the strikers. They decided to give the strikers an ultimatum: leave the plant by 1 o'clock or face forcible eviction. Executive Murray and the head union organizers, Bull Bayman and John Loy, had agreed to end the strike and asked Murray to intervene to prevent violence. Seemingly averting the violence, it is unclear why men from the rally spontaneously grabbed bats, billy clubs, and hammers and ran into the factory. In minutes there were thousands outside the factory. After several insults from the strikers inside, they stormed the factory. The people were brought out, dozens were injured, and the three leading union organizers, Bayman, Loy, and a CIO man named Miles Sweeney, were severely beaten. Sweeney had been beaten with a baseball bat. Loy had lost several teeth, and stones were thrown at them as they left the factory. So in the days after the strike, the National Labor Relations Board investigated the Hershey Company and required that they hold a union election. The chocolate workers chose a small loyalist organization called the Independent Chocolate Workers of Hershey over the CIO by a landslide. However, federal authorities found the election was not legitimate and called for a second election. The second election in 1939 favored the Bakery and Confectionery Workers International Union with the AFL. Their new contract with the AFL gave them an increase in overtime rates, paid vacations, and a procedure for arbitrating grievances. Milton Hershey was deeply affected by this strike. He saw an end to the utopian-like quality of Hershey, PA. He recognized that workers who had battled each other would now have to go back to work with each other, and the innocence that once surrounded Hershey Corporation was lost. This was notable, this strike, because of its historical timing. The chocolate strike came in the middle of a massive wave of CIO strikes, and specifically sit-down strikes. There was a big one in GM, and these sit-down strikes in 170 occupations involving 167,000 workers. The Hershey strikers were organized around the same time as that famous strike in General Motors Corporation in Flint, Michigan, although it did not gain the same momentum. So this is one of those things that had a lot of significance. And the one thing I was wrong on, I had said at previous things, a lot of these strikes, especially the ones having to do with iron workers, result in violence, usually them bringing in like Pinkerton or some organization. That didn't happen here. The violence was completely, apparently the milk farmers were really, really ticked, and they went and beat the living poo out of these people. So it was one of those things. There was a manipulation. Unfortunately, this was partially out of Hershey's hands. So this is the one blight, you would say. And the one thing the workers did start to resent, they didn't like them sort of lording it over them, if you will, and deciding, we know what's best for you. So that's why a lot of these issues happened. It's unfortunate, it really is, but it's an interesting event in working history. It did improve their conditions overall, and it showed the benefits of the union, but it also showed at that time how the unions were viewed by most people. And even though it was for the general populace's benefit, in a lot of ways, because of how Hershey Chocolate Corporation was viewed as being a very benevolent organization, and for the most part they really were. It just, that's how things were. So with that, I want to say thank you for coming along on this journey, and hopefully you learned some stuff and you enjoyed it and it was entertaining. So we will see you all about town and on our next adventure. Thanks, everybody.